Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Jai Janendra, welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jain Miller, and more importantly, I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Jeffery Long at Elizabethtown College. Dr. Long is teaching a course for us in the Compassion Studies Initiative titled Jain Teachings and Practices of Compassion. And I'm very happy to interview Professor Long about this course, about his background, about what compassion means to him. So, Dr. Long, I invite you to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and I thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher, for having me here. It's a great honor to be involved with the work of Arihanta Institute, and I'm excited to be teaching this course on compassion. So if you'd like me to share a bit about my interests and what drew me to this field of study and to the topic of compassion in particular, my interest in religion and philosophy broadly goes all the way back to my early childhood. I've just always been interested in big questions. You know, kids always ask why, and I was one of those. And you can just keep going and going. Why? So the deeper questions of life always intrigued me. Then I had a major crisis from the age of 10 to 12. My father was first in an accident. This eventually led to his death when I was 12. And this just accelerated my interest in these deeper questions. And so I grew up in the Catholic tradition. I found a lot of answers in that tradition, a lot of wisdom. At the same time, there were questions I didn't feel that it answered. And I started looking at various religious traditions, started reading books, whatever I could find about various traditions. And like most Americans, I was very influenced by the popular culture. And my father, I inherited from him a love of music, especially the music of the Beatles in the 1960s. Of course, that whole period is suffused with interest in Indian traditions, meditation, yoga, vegetarianism, an alternative lifestyle and way of viewing the world. This was very intriguing to me. In fact, it fit very well, I thought, with the values I was growing up with in the Catholic Church. I was always very drawn to St. Francis of Assisi. He was the saint who was kind to animals, even preached to the animals. And so a kind of ecological sensibility, that's what I would now call it. At the time, I would just call it, loving nature and seeing divinity in nature. Then I saw the film Gandhi when I was 13, and sort of at the height of this questioning period I was going through after the death of my father. And I was very impressed by Gandhi and started reading everything I could find about Gandhi. And as good fortune or good karma would have it, I came across a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in the most unlikely of places in a sale in the parking lot of one of the local churches in the small Missouri town where I grew up. Started reading the Gita. Its teaching of karma and rebirth made perfect sense to me. It addressed a lot of the questions I had about the afterlife and what happens after we die, what's the purpose of this life. And so from there, it just snowballed. Any books I could get on Indian philosophy, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, these things I started reading. And this just continued on into college. I went to a Catholic university, University of Notre Dame, and I had the good fortune of taking some courses with some very good professors there on traditions of India and of Asia more broadly. And it was then that I realized that, one could make a career of actually teaching people about these things. And I was thinking, wow, I'll just be thinking about all of this all the time. That's exactly what I want to do. So I got good advice. I went to University of Chicago and to the Divinity School, to their excellent program, started studying Sanskrit. And I knew I was drawn primarily to philosophy. A lot of people in our field study sociology or anthropology of religion. I think those are valuable disciplines. I've done some work in those areas as well. But the questions that drive me, I find, are also the ones that drive a lot of my college students. Sure, they're interested in how people live in various parts of the world and so on, but they really want to know how this affects their lives. And are there answers here that could help them in their search for meaning and deeper understanding? So I wanted to go, so I went into the philosophy of religion area. And I also realized that despite all my reading and study in my early years through, middle school and high school, there were gaps in my knowledge. And so I got a big stack of books and started reading anything I could find on Indian philosophy from the great Regenstein Library at Chicago. And that is where I came across the Jain philosophy of anekāntavāda and syadvada, which I had studied a little bit of Jain thought and practice. I had come across it in my journey, but most of what I had found was focusing on the level of practice, the very strict practice of the Jain monks, the very strong emphasis on ahimsa, which of course influenced Mahatma Gandhi so much. But here I found also really great philosophical depth and rigor in terms of logic. One idea that had always appealed to me in the Indian traditions was the harmony of religions, pluralism, the idea that there are many paths to our ultimate goal, that no one no one path or tradition is completely excluded. And so in anekāntavāda, I found a system of logic that could be used to defend that in a very rigorous way. Otherwise, it seems to remain just a kind of nice sentiment, but it quickly raises questions. How could different traditions that teach different things, in some sense, all be true and conducive to a higher realization? And in anekāntavāda, you have the idea, well, the reality is inherently complex. No single philosophical explanation can encompass all of it. Till we reach omniscience, right? Till we get kevala jnana, we don't have that full knowledge. So our knowledge is always partial. And so we have to take into account the perspective from which a claim is made. And given a reality that is infinitely complex, there's just an inconceivably vast number of possible religions and philosophies that might evolve based on people's experiences of different dimensions of that reality. And that's close to what we actually have in the world. So I wrote my dissertation on anekāntavāda. I then, once I had started my career teaching here at Elizabethtown College, I wrote my first book, which was actually on Hinduism, but I had a chapter on Jain philosophy because my understanding of the Hindu tradition also, rather like Gandhi's, it's somewhat shaped by a Jain understanding as well. And my publisher was so pleased with that he said, why don't you write a book on Jainism? And in fact, this was IB Tauris, since they've been subsumed under Bloomsbury, but they had a series on world religions, Religion X, an introduction. So, Christianity, an introduction, Sikhism, an introduction, Zoroastrianism, an introduction. So not a super creative title, but I published Jainism, an introduction back in 2009. And so through writing that, I greatly intensified my studies of the Jain tradition, because it wasn't only on philosophy, right? That book is about people's way of life. And I tried to set it in the broader context of Indian philosophy, which I knew pretty well. I would say I've two things about that book. I've been very gratified by the response to it through the years. The International School of Jain Studies uses it in their curriculum. I've been very honored by the responses I've gotten from the Jain community to that book. At the same time, as I often say, I now know I've learned more about the Jain tradition since I wrote the book than I knew when I wrote it. So if I were ever given the opportunity to write a second edition, I would love to, and it'll probably be twice as long. And I'll have to somehow keep it within a reasonable length so people will still read it. I would love to go back and expand upon that book, because really I think it's really just an introduction. It just scratches the surface. And I've been really gratified by my ongoing engagement with the Jain community, given a lot of talks at various Jain centers, including the Jaina conference here in North America. It's just been a wonderful journey to really get to know this tradition in ever greater depth. It is so rich and so detailed in terms of how it describes reality, describes the world, describes our experience. Like many traditions from India, it's full of lists, full of various collections of various principles associated with the diverse aspects of life, and so it in some way reinforces something I heard a friend of mine once say. He was a scholar more of Chinese traditions, but he knew a bit about India, and he made the observation that in China, he says, spirituality is an art, but in India, it's a science. And I think with the Jain tradition, you can see that really to the nth degree. I mean, everything is very thoroughly categorized and explained. So that just that level of depth and detail is itself fascinating. And so coming to the topic of compassion, which is really our main concern today, here too, the Jain tradition has applied the same kind of analytic rigor, 8 forms of compassion described in Srimad Rajchandra's Mokshamala, and really a very profound understanding of what compassion is. And from my perspective, and again, this goes all the way back to my childhood, I think compassion is probably the most important thing in life, maybe even more than seeking truth, is that we be kind, and that we see others as they see themselves, and that we treat them accordingly, and that this is a quality that we profoundly need in our world today. And of course, we know a lot about the cruelty and the violence that pervades our news cycles. What we don't always see, sometimes you'll see a little good news story kind of off to the side just to keep everyone from getting, suicidal after watching the news. But behind every one of these stories of cruelty and violence, we know there are also stories of compassion, that there are people that are there helping, and that in every great story of human violence, genocides around the world, there have been people who've risked their lives to save others, to protect others, even given their lives to protect and save people from maybe another community. And that this quality, I think, is what's going to really help us survive as a human species. And it's something we need to cultivate more consciously. And traditions like the Jain tradition give us wonderful tools for doing exactly that.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And what I noted as you went through that, the introduction to yourself, and it terminates then in your study of Jain tradition, and then eventually compassion through many perspectives, including the Jain tradition, both epistemic compassion in the sense that we respect other people's worldviews, and also just compassion in daily life, despite what we know, so to speak, just being kind and compassionate to one another. And what I note in your story, and I think a lot of us share this, and other professors who are teaching in the Compassion Studies Initiative often convey, is some kind of experience that happened very early on in their life that brought them to this space, into the conversation we're having right now. And you note there's some story of shock, of some kind of existential shock in our narrative across traditions, and including what brings us to the Jain tradition. And these traditions kind of answer those questions. And one of the fundamental answers that often comes up is to practice, among other things, compassion to one another. And compassion, as you said, of course, to the environment, to other forms of life, non-human animals, insects, plants, everything. And in this case, really like compassion to one another as humans belonging to the same species. So the Jain tradition, obviously, as you said here, has a lot to offer in that regard. And what I was hoping we could do is kind of in an instructive way, you can kind of tell us a little bit about your course on Jain teachings and compassion that you're going to be teaching at Arihanta Institute, because I think this gives us a preview of what the Jain tradition in particular offers to this conversation on compassion. So do you want to tell us a little bit like an overview of the course before we dive into the different pieces of it so people know what this course is about?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So there are going to be 4 distinct sessions, and I think we're going to discuss the details of each of those in a bit. But if I had to summarize the whole thing, what I'm trying to do in the course is to convey really 2 things primarily. One is how compassion fits within the broader Jain worldview, that it is something that is entailed by, logically, the understanding of existence that the Jain tradition proposes, that compassion is not merely a sentiment or an emotion, but it is a product of insight into the ways in which all beings are deeply interconnected, that the actions we carry out toward another being, we are really in reality carrying out toward ourselves, really seeing ourselves in others. And when we have that perception, when we have that insight, the logical outflow, the natural, you could say the spontaneous effect of that is to live compassionately. So that's part of it. Where does this fit within Jain philosophy? And it is a logical outflow of Jain philosophy. Secondly, I wanted to talk about some specific historical instances of this. And there's a sort of, there's this concept in Indian philosophy of the Purva Paksha, right? The other perspective. And the implied, I'm just going to make it explicit, the explicit Purva Paksha, the contrary perspective with which I'm engaging in this course is a notion one sometimes finds, and I think this is because of some earlier writing on Jainism by Western scholars that came before there was really a more in-depth knowledge of the tradition. You sometimes see this claim made that the Jain ethic is purely negative in nature. It involves not harming, but really doesn't say much about helping, right? That, you don't want to harm other beings, but you're not really doing anything to aid other beings. And I think in an earlier era, there was a Christian polemical intent behind this, right? Because when scholars from the West would encounter the positive values and virtues in other traditions, there was always an attempt to very quickly in some way downplay or contextualize that such that the superiority of Christianity would not be questioned, right? So they were very nervous about people like Swami Vivekananda and Veerayatan Gandhi coming into the West and showing how appealing these traditions were, especially in an increasingly skeptical Western world. And so they say, okay, yeah, they're good on nonviolence, but what about love, right? We do the love thing much better than they do, right? That's kind of the unspoken, or depending on how early the literature is, sometimes explicitly spoken subtext of a lot of that early writing. So the after effects of that, and I think this is often the case, it takes about a century for a bad theory to really go away. Like it's like the smell of it sort of remains for a long time. And so I'm seeing a growing effort among both scholars and people in the Jain community to say, no, compassion is a very deeply interwoven aspect of the Jain tradition right from the beginning, that it is a tradition based on empathy, first and foremost. And so empathy involves, on the one hand, not harming, and that's the aspect that has been most emphasized in our literature on the Jain tradition, but it also involves helping. It also involves positive acts of compassion. There's a video I like to show my students. I might find a way to incorporate this into the course as well. There was a Jain couple just a few years ago, about 15 years ago or so. And like many Jains, they're an affluent family. And they did an incredible act of compassion. They, with their own funds, set up a massive camp in Gujarat, in India. And they were doing two things. They were providing prosthetic limbs to poor people who could not afford them and who needed them. And there were a lot. And you see this line of people with missing arms and missing legs. And they're providing these prosthetic limbs and helping these people walk and move around and have a little more mobility and more dignity. And then they were also providing aid for people with poor eyesight, getting free eye tests and then free glasses, made to their specifications. So people were able to see and walk who weren't able to see or walk so well before. So this is purely an act of compassion. It's not simply nonviolence. It's not in the sense of not harming. They were doing good for these people, and this came from their Jain convictions. So I think this is a very important thing for us to underscore, that ahimsa, which of course is absolutely central in Jainism, not harming, that one of its implications is that, well, if you don't want to harm, what do you want to do? Well, you want to help, right? That ahimsa implies a deep concern for the well-being of all entities, all living entities. And so as such, compassion, you could say, is the logical corollary of ahimsa. But it's not only that, it is discussed as an independent virtue in the Jain tradition. Daya, compassion, sometimes you see the term karuna. This is absolutely central. It's part of the path to moksha. And so this is something I want to emphasize a lot in the course, the philosophy behind it, and also actual instances of this happening. And as we work through the modules, we'll see where we're talking about some very prominent historical examples of that.
Wonderful. Yes. And as you're describing all of this as compassion as a kind of action that naturally or logically evolves from the commitment to ahimsa, I was just in the back of my mind remembering the first time I read the Acharya Sutra, and I saw Mahavira sitting there looking at the life around him, and you can't help but feel the sense that of compassion for all forms of life in that moment. So it was a sentiment that then moved him to behave and be in the world in a particular way. We can't just leave the world because we want to be compassionate. It in fact involves the opposite, right? There's a full immersion into the world. And so we can go through the four pieces of your course right now, because I think they really illustrate well everything you've just summarized in the kind of intent and overall description of the course. But in the first module, you're talking about the worldview in particular that drives this role of compassion. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Maybe some of the readings. I see you have Srimad Rajchandra there, and what you intend to convey by first, why are we setting up the worldview first?
Well, setting up the worldview first, this is just how I think as someone trained in philosophy, that you begin with first principles. So what is a traditional Jain understanding of reality itself? And so we'll do not terribly in depth, because I also assume that a lot of people taking this course probably already have some working knowledge of the Jain tradition, but not everyone will have that to the same extent. So the basic principles of jiva, karma, moksha, the moksha marga, the path to liberation, the stages that involves, and to show that compassion is integral to that, right? That it is not something we're sort of adding on, but that it emerges from the beginning. And even some discussion, as you mentioned the Acharya Sutra. I love the Acharya Sutra, and you could just see Mahavir sitting out in the woods. And as you say, he's withdrawn from society, and he's looking around. He's finding himself in another whole society of birds and plants, and even the tiny crawling insects. And because his mind had become so calm and still, he could perceive all of that and feel compassion for all of that. Right. So, Srimad Rajchandra is a very important part of this. He is, of course, a relatively recent Jain figure. But I think he'll go down in history as one of the great Jain philosophers. And in his Mokshamala, he enunciates 8 specific forms of compassion. We're going to delve into each of those in some depth, and those each have context as well. Some of them, for example, clearly come from out of a monastic context. At the same time, they also have universal applicability. So we can talk about, okay, this is what this most likely means in a Jain context. How can we now apply that and think about that in terms of our day-to-day lives and how we interact with people in the world, our families, our coworkers, and all the other living beings that we encounter? So that's the focus really of the first part, to give that wider context. And even some of what I had mentioned when I was talking about the course as a whole will be put there right at the beginning, that we're really working against this inaccurate stereotype of the Jain tradition as somehow uninvolved with the good of beings in the world.
Yeah, wonderful. I get that sense that, so I asked that question, why do we do the worldview first? But I think it's the right thing to do, right? And some of the students will be new to the Jain tradition, so they'll get a sense of this worldview, this very compassionate, nonviolent worldview in its roots. And I see, as I look at the syllabus, I see you have basic readings on that as well as some new ones, like in Mokshamala. Not a lot of people, I think, in the Western world especially, have read Mokshamala by Srimad Rajchandra. So that'll be an interesting way for them to dive into these different forms of compassion. And what I'm also hearing, and I forgot to mention earlier, is that acts of compassion towards all forms of life, including to other human beings, are in fact acts of self-compassion, because we are in engagement. So this question of self-compassion often comes up all over the place in Jain studies with our students. What about me? I have to take care of myself. But in a way, what I hear you conveying as well is that taking care of others is a form of self-compassion. It's one form of self-compassion, at least. That's an important one, because the way we engage with the world, it comes back to affect us as well, right?
Precisely. I mean, if you really take the idea of karma seriously, it means that the experiences of our lives are a mirror of our own consciousness and our own behavior. And so, and you can observe it. I mean, you see sometimes maybe a child who's very upset because, people are picking on me, people are being mean to me. And you observe that child in action, and you see, they've been a total bully. They've been picking on everybody. Are we to be surprised that they're now getting that back, right? So that it's happening. And of course, that's not always the case. Sometimes someone's bullied for no apparent good reason, but we see that. I remember I read a cartoon many years ago. This old cartoon, The Family Circus, and it's about a family. So there's this little boy comes running to his mother, and he's pointing a finger at his brother, and he's upset, and he's saying, "Mommy, he hit me back." Not just he hit me back, right? So it's like, well, you hit him first, right? So we understand that if we ourselves, in fact, are the ones who initiated, either in this life or in some earlier lifetime, the experiences that are coming back to us, right away you see a motive for compassion. Now, one could critique this as a selfish motive, but you have to start somewhere, right? You have to start somewhere. And so if for no other reason than to avoid harm to oneself, one should avoid harming other beings. But the hope is that that's just the first step in a series of stages in which one deepens one's compassion, so that finally you reach the point where you could no more harm another being than you could harm yourself, right? That you begin to see the interconnections of life so profoundly that you feel the hurt that others experience as though it was carried out to you. And this goes again back to the Acharya Sutra, where Mahavira says, you in fact are the one you are harming. You are in fact the one you are dominating. All of these negative things we do, we in fact are doing to ourselves, both in a karmic sense and also in the deeper sense that we are all interconnected. You can see the cosmos itself as one vast organism of which we are each members. And so hurting another being would be like if you suddenly started, striking at your own body. Like, why would you do that? Right. So this is the understanding. And I think also it underscores, starting with the worldview, underscores that compassion is not merely a sentiment. It's integrated into a very logically rigorous analysis of the nature of existence.
Wonderful. And I think that's precisely where I was trying to go with this as we go into class 2, as we talk about coexistence and being part of this. There's a logic that leads to us wanting to coexist compassionately in this tradition. So class 2 is titled, and I'm reading right off the syllabus, Compassionate Coexistence, Anekāntavāda and its implications for interfaith relations. So here you're specifically going into the way that different traditions can interact with one another compassionately, can coexist, can get along in a sense. You want to tell us a little bit about that? I know you talked about anekāntavāda a bit before, but with regard to the course specifically.
Absolutely, because and this has been one of the main driving interests I've had in the Jain tradition from the beginning. This concept of anekāntavāda and its potential implications for pluralism and for coexistence. I think this is extremely important. Now, if we delve into the study of Jain philosophy, one thing we find is that there have been some very good scholars who have critiqued the idea that anekāntavāda is somehow connected with nonviolence and compassion. They'll point out that there are Jain texts where anekāntavāda is essentially used to show that the Jain view is a more complete or more comprehensive view than the merely partial truths perceived in other traditions. But I think we make a mistake if we forget that this is a living tradition. And again, by looking at a recent thinker like Srimad Rajchandra, we're saying, oh, this is in continuity with what has been said before, and yet it is also a new statement. And what I have seen in the Jain community is really, with regard to anekāntavāda, an explosion, if you will, of interest in anekāntavāda as a form of nonviolence at the intellectual level, right? Sometimes you hear this term intellectual ahimsa, that yes, there may have been authors in the past who've used it in another way, but it can also be used to show that all the various philosophies and religions of the world can be coordinated onto something like a vast map or grid, you could say, of reality. And the Jain tradition has one understanding of that larger grid, but within that you can incorporate core insights of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, modern science. A whole host of worldviews can be sort of fit within this larger grid. Now, what's the point of talking about a grid? Well, this is just a maybe somewhat more modern way of talking about the traditional image of the blind people and the elephant, right? That there is reality as such, that has a true and objective nature, setting aside for a moment the question of what that nature actually is. Anekāntavāda is working with the idea that prior to omniscience, prior to Kevalajnana, we're all seeing only part of that whole. And nonviolence and compassion enter into this in a couple of ways. One is the acknowledgement that the perspective of another may be just as good as mine, maybe better than mine in some respect. They may be, if you think of us as all kind of existing within this terrain, some people maybe are up on a mountain, and so they see a little further. But maybe what they see is hazy and remote. Someone else might be living down in that landscape, and they know that landscape intimately. They know the trees and the birds and every blade of grass very well. They don't know the world beyond that little portion, right? This is a metaphor I'm using to talk about various traditions. There are traditions that go very in depth in some aspects of life. So at the risk of stereotyping, but we can talk about some of the big themes of the world's religions. Christianity is very big on self-sacrificing love. That's also a theme we see in Mahayana Buddhism. Advaita Vedanta is very big on the nature of consciousness and what is consciousness and who and what are we within the field of consciousness. The Taoist tradition of China is very big on nature and process and the dynamic process of existence. None of these things is inherently contradictory to the others. It's just that the various traditions have gone into great depth with regard to those facets of reality that they have found central. The Dalai Lama once joked to a group of Hindu teachers. He said, "You all are the experts on self, and we are the experts on non-self." And in his very humorous way, the Dalai Lama was very compassionately and gently saying that, our traditions appear to be saying different things. Maybe they are saying different things, but we're looking at reality as a whole, and each from our own particular field in which we have particular knowledge and expertise. So anekāntavāda, as I understand it, invites us to be open to the truths in all of these various spheres of existence. Now, another place where compassion comes into the conversation of anekāntavāda is, okay, if we've established that the views of others are valuable and contain truth, no less than our own, then how do we behave when we encounter people with different views? And I think we can see a great counterexample if we just take a quick look at social media and the intense polarization and the rudeness and foul language and anger that we see people directing against those whose views differ from their own. Sometimes in the realm of religion, of course, primarily in the realm of politics, but these two are often very closely aligned. And so that's not compassionate, right? So the antidote to this, the opposite of it, one could say, is coming into the conversation with an attitude of, okay, you have a different perspective from mine, assuming that you are also an intelligent and thoughtful person, which is a compassionate assumption, I think. Why do you think that? Teach me. Tell me why you believe as you believe. I may not in the end be persuaded, but I'm probably going to learn something. And I'm probably going to be able to supplement my own view with some insight that I get from you, right? Just a very, again, simplistic example. A lot of our political polarization in the United States, philosophically speaking, what you see in the two dominant parties is one emphasizing individualism a little more, the other emphasizing social goods more and our common good. And I think it doesn't take a lot of really profound philosophical thought to realize that you need both of those, right? That an emphasis on the social good without regard to the individual is oppressive, and an emphasis on the individual without regard to the social good is anarchic in the very negative sense, right? That society would collapse altogether. And so we need both. And certainly, there are things that each of these sides can learn from the other. If we come with an attitude that we all understand a different piece of reality and we would all do well to learn from what the other has to say. But doing that is also a practice of compassion toward that person. It's saying, look, I value you. I don't see you merely as an opponent, merely as someone I need to defeat, merely as someone that I need to say something rude to so I can get likes from my friends on social media. You're someone with whom I want to engage and learn. And we differ on a lot of things, but I want to know why you think that, because my assumption is a compassionate one, that you're as smart as I am. And so you must have gone through some process that has led you to that understanding. So I think anekāntavāda can be very powerful if, of course, the question is, how do we promote this idea? And the danger we run into, too, is anekāntavāda itself becomes just another idea. I say, look, reality is complex. It can be viewed from many facets. And the other person just has to say, no, it isn't. So then there can be another argument. And this is why, ultimately, I think philosophy finally points beyond itself to the direct experience of reality. That is what all these traditions are rooted in. And the great Jain thinker Haribhadra Suri talks about this in his Yoga Drishti Samuchaya. He says, all the great masters talk about a state that is beyond rebirth, beyond suffering, beyond limitation. But they teach different ways of reaching it and some different conceptualizations of it. And he says this is due to the differences in the capacities of their followers, or differences in the times and places in which they spoke. And so, again, he's working with the assumption that all these perspectives contain deep truth. A compassionate approach to truth is one in which we take all of them seriously. And I think it's almost self-evident that would lead to a better world than what we're currently experiencing with polarization, which is just the opposite, I think, of anekāntavāda.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I can really see, you've set up in this course the Jain worldview in the first section. Second section really looks at compassion for the way that others think, and being compassionate about, even to ourselves, that even our worldviews are limited, but all of our worldviews have some value to add to a conversation that's trying to arrive towards some truth. What I really appreciate is in the next two modules we go through, then you start to talk about practice, really on the ground stuff of how do we live this out in our daily lives, beyond worldview, beyond respecting other people's worldviews, which is all important. Then, like, what can we also do that materially affects, compassion in our surroundings and in the world that we live in? And so class 3 goes into this it's called Enough for Everyone's Need. And I think you're riffing on Gandhi there in a way, sort of quoting, paraphrasing Gandhi there. Aparigraha, so non-possession, as compassionate consumption. Yes. Tell us about this. So now we're talking about like how we, eat, how we consume, how we do things. How is this how are these things? How is non-possessiveness or non-attachment, however you want to define that? How is that a form of compassion, and what will we learn there?
Very good. Very good. Yes. Yeah. The third unit is on aparigraha, which is, of course, one of the 5 vrats, one of the 5 main moral principles in the Jain tradition. It literally means non-grasping or non-possession. And how does that relate to compassion? The way it relates to compassion is that in a world of finite resources, everything we take for ourselves, we are in some sense taking from someone else. And so part of the Jain path is cultivating a greater sense of detachment from material things, a greater sense that we really can be, in terms of our happiness, in terms of our contentment, quite happy with practically nothing. And in fact, the Jain munis and sadhvis, the Jain monks and nuns, embody this by giving up pretty much everything. And the Digambara tradition probably is most radical in this regard. The male ascetics don't even have clothing that is their own. And so how is this a form of compassion? Well, less for me, more for everyone else. It's really a very simple kind of mathematical way of thinking about it if you look at it. And we live today in a world of massive overconsumption, right? We don't all, but I'm thinking about we in the West. I'm just looking at my office behind me, like, books and boxes. There's so much stuff. There's this great Tracy Chapman song called Mountains of Things, right? And, we have mountains of things. Are we actually happier with those things? Sometimes those things cause us a lot of anxiety. I think one of the most stressful experiences a modern American can have is moving from one location to another. You've done it, right, Chris? You've moved to a different country, right? And you have to get rid of stuff. Or if you want to keep it, you have to go to great effort and expense to box it up and either by yourself or pay someone to move it to another location. Think if all that energy went into doing good for the world and spending time listening to people who were having problems or suffering, or doing some concrete work like, building houses for the poor or working in a soup kitchen, or, so many things that we could be spending our time and energy on, but we're spending it on our stuff. And so this is, on a mass scale, this is killing us, right? The climate crisis has been driven to a very large extent by consumption. And of course, consumption of energy, but then that requires production of energy. And that has been the process that has so filled the atmosphere with carbon that the temperature is going up. This is having all kinds of effects, both foreseen and unforeseen, on the climate, which is creating more suffering in the world. So there's been a direct correlation between consumption and suffering. And so as with anekāntavāda, what's the solution? Well, the opposite of what we've been doing, which is aparigraha, right? And the argument of the course, especially this unit, is not that we all need to become Digambara Jain monks. That's not even realistic to expect. The Jain tradition itself does not expect that, right? There will always be householders whose function is to support those people who have gone all the way in their renunciation. But there'll always be people who, in order to keep society going, there needs to be some amount of production and consumption happening, right? That's what an economy is. But how do we do that in a way that's mindful and that's compassionate, that's minimally destructive and maximally helpful to the beings around us? And there's so much we can do, both on a large scale social and political level, but even at the individual level. Not consuming meat, right, is one right away that you see in the Jain tradition, right? The practice of vegetarianism is very ancient and is not only something that would reduce the amount of destruction going on in the world to animals, the harm being done to animals, but it would also help with the climate crisis and the climate issue. Even beyond vegetarianism, of course, is veganism, which a growing number of Jains are adopting. That using animal products at all treats animals as raw material, and animals aren't raw material. They're conscious beings with feelings, and you get to know them. You can see that that's the case, right? It doesn't even take a big leap of the imagination to understand that these are souls, these are jivas. But we're also creating suffering for human beings by contributing to the climate crisis through mass consumption. Also with highly unequal wealth distribution. Again, some of this is a big issue that would have to be tackled on a more collective political and social scale. But even in our day-to-day lives, we can make decisions in terms of what we consume, consuming less and also consuming smartly, products that have less impact on the environment. And there are ways to do this. And some of this requires research. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the concept of greenwashing. Everyone just has to put eco in front of their product name, and suddenly it's good for the environment, and yet they're still doing the same stuff. So, what are the actually really good, ecologically sound or more ecologically sound products that we could utilize? But the other thing is, I think the key thing is that, again, not everyone is going to become a Digambara monk, but all of us could consume less, right? When we look at our purchases, when we look at how we're spending our money and our time and our energy, there are many, many ways in which we could simply say, okay, I'm not going to take that extra, whatever it might be. I'm going to take just what I need for my existence. But I'm going to look very realistically at that and say, well, there's a lot that I don't need. You and I were having a conversation before the podcast about a conference that we both attend. And for personal reasons, I'm not going to be going this year. But, if we think about conferences, look at all of the airplane fuel that gets expended and used, and all the waste that goes in the atmosphere when we're all flying around. In fact, I was once going to a conference on religion and ecology, and I was just, as I was flying there, I was thinking of the irony of the fact that I was flying there. One thing that this wonderful Zoom technology has brought about is the fact that we can actually have a conference without moving around so much and expending fuel to such a great extent. We can do these things without that. And so many ways that we could utilize technologies that are available to us, and just very ancient practices of mindfulness and discernment. Do I really need this thing? On our whole society, especially in the West, but I think this is global now, is built around actually creating a desire and a sense that you need this product. A really good advertiser, they're going to make you feel like you need that thing, right? You're not going to be popular. You're not going to be healthy. Your life will just not be as good if you don't buy this thing that we're trying to sell you. And so aparigraha is really working against that. It's really saying, I don't really need that, actually. I got by fine with that for many years. I got by fine without that. I don't need that new thing. It goes back to Gandhi's, of course, great expression that, yes, I'm sort of paraphrasing in the title of this section, he said that the world has enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. And really, that's the Jain perspective in a nutshell, that out of our greed, we could consume the whole world. And that would be an act of tremendous violence. And it's what we've been doing to a very great extent. We can do the opposite. We can withdraw from so many of these activities and consumption habits and consumption practices we have. And again, it doesn't have to be something on a grand social scale. Something simple like not wasting food. So much food goes to waste. In America, we have the practice of, in many restaurants, the amount of food that you are given when you order food is much more than a human stomach can actually hold. I mean, it's physically more than we can healthily eat. And there's this sense that if they don't do that, that people are going to feel like they haven't been given a full meal, right? They haven't been satisfied. So the result of that is, unless people are enterprising enough to take their leftovers home with them and get another 2 or 3 meals out of it, which is what my wife and I typically do, a lot of that food just gets thrown away. It's a complete waste. And then if you add to that the fact that a lot of this is non-vegetarian food, then you could say that these animals who were killed for that consumption really died for nothing. I mean, they weren't even consumed, right? We could say. Imagine that your body was destroyed for someone else to consume. Now, this happens in nature, of course. Lions, eat other animals. But imagine you were killed in that way and then not even consumed. Just a waste of a life. And this is what's happening when food is being wasted. Life is being just thrown away. That's the ultimate form of violence, I would think. Just an utterly meaningless and senseless destruction of life without even and of course, I mean, from a Jain perspective, even, consuming a life form for food, even that is problematic. But what I'm saying is that if the animal is killed and then it's thrown away, you can't even kind of give that kind of half-hearted justification. Well, it fed someone. No, it didn't even do that. It ended up in a landfill. That's horrific when we think about that, and it's happening on a massive scale daily. So don't waste food. It's a very simple thing, and again, making food choices that don't involve destruction to life forms, that don't involve destruction to the environment. Increasingly, it's becoming possible to get the energy for your home from renewable sources. I have the good fortune of being able to connect with an electric company that has both solar and wind farms, and my energy it's distributed by our local distributor here in Pennsylvania, but it comes from this wind and solar farm in another state, and it's transmitted here. And so like the energy that's fueling, our lights, our computer, all of it is coming from wind and solar. And, options like that are things that more of us can avail of. Those are a little expensive, but I also want to focus in the course on things that anybody can do, right? Things that even if you have modest resources, it's possible to consume less. It's possible not to waste. Even taking up a lot of space can be a problematic thing. Some people have, some of us have big homes that take up a lot of land. A lot of that land could be just left for the wilderness, right? For people to see and enjoy, and for the animals to live freely, and for the trees to generate oxygen. And we're just eating it up. I live in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. It has some of the richest farmland in the United States, but it's being paved over increasingly. And for what? For consumption. Houses and malls, right? These is taking over everything. So I've kind of rambled at length about that, but this is the gamut of topics that I want to cover in that third unit.
That's wonderful, because the third unit, as you've described it just now, It really focuses on things that we can do individually right now within our capacities, as you mentioned, to immediately, engage in non-practices, not doing things that are actually then an extension of compassion because they don't cause environmental harm, they don't cause climate change, they don't contribute to the suffering of human and non-human beings. And so that's the kind of individual piece there. And then when we get into section 4, what I really like is then you start to look at it more socially now, right? Because in class 4, Jain Compassion in Practice, as it's called, the examples of Veerayatan and Anuvrat movement. And one of the things I noticed on the syllabus is that you included 2 of the chapters from our book, which is behind me. People probably can't see it right now because they're listening, Beacons of Dharma. We had 2 chapters on the Jain tradition in there, and you're including both of those. And I'm glad that you did, because they talk about how these 2 organizations put into practice and encourage us to put into practice at a more social level in many ways, these Jain principles. You want to say a little bit about that last piece?
Absolutely. And one of the things that is powerful about both of these examples is these initiatives were carried out by Jain ascetics. And so this really kind of helps counter the argument, again, that Purva Paksha that I mentioned earlier, that, well, this is a very modern way of thinking, and Jainism traditionally is really just about not harming, and it's not about compassion and so on. But this is coming from the heart of the tradition, right? From ascetics who had committed fully to the Jain way of life in as much as it's humanly possible to do so. And so Veerayatan is an initiative that does great good in terms of outreach socially, doing work, which in the Western world, this would sometimes be called charity. But the concept of compassion is very different from the concept of charity, because the concept of charity, and if I can quote from the Hindu tradition briefly, Swami Vivekananda makes a sharp differentiation between what he calls seva, authentic service, and the way he characterizes charity, which is, you're a wealthy person and you kind of drop a few coins into the hands of a beggar and say, "Here, my poor man," and then you feel very good about yourself because look how generous I am, right? And the concept of compassion is really more like seva. It's more like service to the world. It's doing good for others, because yes, it does make you feel good, but it also helps to purify the ego and purify our consciousness, because we're putting our time and effort not into something just for our own pleasure or enjoyment, but because it helps others, because it's good for others. And so Veerayatan has done tremendous work in terms of providing social services to people in India. And then you have the Anuvrat movement, which was really, I love the audacity of the Anuvrat movement, because you have Acharya Tulsi, renowned Jain mendicant, basically saying, let's transform all of Indian politics and society by promoting basic Jain values. And the Anuvrats, of course, it refers to the 5 so-called lesser vows, though they involve quite a lot of effort, vows of householders in the Jain tradition, which are nonviolence, telling the truth, not stealing, following chastity and self-control. And then, of course, the one we were just discussing, aparigraha, right? Not being greedy, not being attached to material things. And they're the same as the Mahavrats, followed by the Jain mendicants, except the Jain mendicants follow them to the extent humanly possible. The Anuvrats, the householders follow these to the degree that it's possible while being a householder, right? While having an economically productive life and a home and a family and all of those things. But yet there's a lot we can do even within the realm of the Anuvrats. And so what Acharya Tulsi promoted was something simple like telling the truth. We think, well, that's easy. Yeah, but look at the realm of politics, right? And he was specifically interested in the realm of politics. He wanted to clean up corruption. And as a result, the movement was really quite popular, because ordinary people in India, well, just like people everywhere, don't like being lied to, don't like having to give a bribe in order to get some very basic human right made available to them. They don't like all of those inconveniences that can be imposed by a bloated bureaucracy. And so Acharya Tulsi was doing something which I think was incredibly clever, because, and I mean clever in the positive sense, being political while being apolitical. Because he wasn't taking a side for or against any political party or for or against any particular politician, but he was making a very strong statement about what people ought to do in that realm. And so it has powerful political implications, but it doesn't involve taking a side, right? So he could be deeply political while at the same time staunchly apolitical. And that's hard to pull off, right? in our world today, but also in his time, which is not so far removed from our time. I believe he passed away in 1970. But he was dealing with many of the same issues that we are now. And his movement is still there in India. It is still an ongoing thing, and scholars have been doing research on it. So yeah, we have the very good article by Michael Redding from Beacons of Dharma on the Anuvrat movement. And we also have the excellent article by Anekāntavāda on the Veerayatan initiative. And yeah, these are, I heard her present on Veerayatan at the Dhanam conference a number of years ago. And the thought occurred to me, is there a Mahayana Jainism emerging? For people who might be familiar with Buddhism, what I mean by that is that, again, it's in perfect continuity with Jain teaching, going back to Mahavira himself. But is there a new emphasis on compassion, perhaps? Maybe in response to that old charge that, well, this community is mainly just interested in not harming, that we're really starting to see some powerful initiatives directly from the monastic community to engage more with the world. I think, again, a real leader on this was Acharya Tulsi. I would add, in addition to the Anuvrat movement, he started what we might call intermediate order of Jain ascetics, the Samans and Samanis, who are Jain ascetics, but they don't take all of the ascetic vows that traditional Munis and Sadhvis do. So they can travel abroad, for example. They're able to engage, therefore, with the Jain community globally and with the global community in a way that they were not previously. So you could see he very clearly had a strong interest in this kind of engaged Jainism, I guess we could call it. To again borrow a term from Buddhism, but I want to, in some sense, in the last section, kind of make a circle and go back to the first section in the conclusion and say, well, we might call this engaged Jainism, or maybe this is just Jainism, right? Because the principles are there right from the beginning of promoting compassion, promoting engagement with the world toward reducing the suffering of living beings and contributing to their happiness and their well-being.
Another wonderful summary of that module, and showing what we call and refer to as engaged Jainism. Jains engaging the world, and engaging the world in particular with compassion based on the teachings that you taught through the whole class, right? So it's great that students will not only get inspired to do things on their own, they'll also be able to see how it's being acted out for human welfare in particular, especially, and ecological welfare in this last section. One of the last things I ask, and you're free to share anything else you want here, Jeff, in this regard is how can our listeners begin to develop more compassion in their lives from any perspective? I mean, what would you offer our listeners in that regard?
Okay, I will answer that. Before I do, I just wanted to throw in one quick point that I thought of as you were just speaking just now. Arihanta Institute is itself an example of engaged Jainism too. So we're doing the thing that we're talking about. There's a beautiful logical kind of symmetry about this whole thing. But in terms of your very important, I think very urgent question, what can listeners do to develop more compassion in their own lives? Two things, I think. One is that we have to understand, I think, if we really look at compassion as the Indic traditions do, as an insight that emerges from our understanding of our deep interconnection with all beings, that really realizing that our own good is tied to the good of all beings. And so sometimes this can be misunderstood. I have students very often who will say, isn't it selfish to be thinking about yourself at all? I have a friend who's a Buddhist monk, Bhante Sujata, and he periodically comes and speaks here at our college. And he has taught the students something called the meditation on loving kindness, which is part of the Theravada Buddhist tradition. And there's similar meditations we see in the Jain tradition as well. And it begins with showing compassion to yourself. And compassion to yourself doesn't mean, let me consume that next shiny object so that it can fill the infinite void in my heart, right? It doesn't mean that. Compassion to ourselves really means understanding from a Jain perspective, I am in reality not this physical body. I am the jiva, I am the soul, I am infinite. I contain within myself infinite knowledge, infinite perception, infinite energy, infinite bliss, and may I be content in that understanding. and to take some time each day to reflect upon that and remind oneself of that this is who and what we really are. And then we'll find, paradoxically, right, this seemingly selfish practice of focusing on oneself, we find that we need less than we thought we did, that we don't have to consume so much when we have that sense of contentment within ourselves. When we have that sense of contentment within ourselves, we also feel stronger, that we have more, as we say nowadays, bandwidth to do good for others. That when we realize that we are an infinite soul, that you start to get this feeling that there's nothing that can stop you, right? That you want to manifest that goodness of the soul to everyone you meet. And it doesn't cost anything at all to smile, to greet someone kindly, to be a beacon of light, a beacon of compassion. We can say a beacon of dharma, right, in the world. And so to start with ourselves, I think, in the sense of being compassionate. And again, we're not talking about the egotistic, selfish sense. We're talking about penetrating down to that deeper essence of the soul that is our true being. It's because we're inattentive to that we think that getting more stuff can make us happy. But when we realize what we really are, then there's a deep sense of contentment that emerges. And from that contentment, from that space of strength, you could say, then we have the ability to be compassionate. I think sometimes people don't feel they can be compassionate because they don't feel they have that strength within themselves. Like, I have to take care of my own self. I don't have time for anyone else, right? But when you realize that deep sense of strength from within, then that empowers you to go. And then people look at someone like Gandhi and say, where did he find the energy to do all of what he did? Well, he was focused within, right? He had that groundedness in spirituality. So I think one thing is to start with being compassionate to ourselves. We're constantly sending negative messages to ourselves. And a lot of these are messages we've absorbed from the consumerist society in which we exist. Oh, I need this, this, and this, and then I can be happy. But no, happiness is just the nature of the soul. We can be happy right now. True happiness has no cause. It just is. It is our nature. The second thing I would say, which is really connected with the first, is taking some amount of time, as busy as we all are, a little bit of time every day for some kind of practice of mindfulness and meditation, because this will help strengthen that sense of connection with the soul, which will then in turn strengthen that sense of capacity we have that will enable us to go and be compassionate and do good in the world, because we'll feel it flowing from within us. We won't feel that it's some kind of scarce resource. That this is the one non-finite resource, is the soul itself. And so getting in touch with that through some regular practice of calming the mind, whether you use a mantra, whether you practice something as elaborate as samayak, which many Jains do, or praksha meditation, or, just from whatever tradition you're in, just a little bit of time each day to calm the mind, quiet it, and feel that inner divinity that's present in all of us.
Beautifully said. And in a way, it feels like a Jain inflected form of self-care, not a self-absorbed form of self-care with a small s, but a capital S, self-absorbed, in the sense that then leads us to feel like we want to be more compassionate. Because, in the yoga world too, there's a lot of work that's done, from a scientific perspective on the nervous system. And when you get to that place where your nervous system isn't in fight or flight, wherever it is, you want to show up, and you do show up as a more compassionate person, just kind of biologically, right? And so there's a sense of this kind of Jain notion of being in touch with that infinite self with a capital S, not the kind of small self-care that is also important, but there's a larger vision behind it in this Jain philosophy that is undergirded by this what you've just described quite wonderfully.
I love the way you've said that. And, and it prompts another thought. Sometimes when we have these conversations, sometimes I might sound critical of, our dominant society and the way people interact and so on. But a lot of these people are just frazzled. They feel that they're at their wits' end. And so, of course, they're lashing out. And of course, they're angry. And of course, they're polarized. If they could get in touch with that infinite resource within, then that sense of peace would emerge, and they would lose interest in that kind of conflictual mode of being. They wouldn't feel they need to do that, right? What prompted that thought was when you use the term fight or flight. And I think that people are in that mode a lot of the time. And so we see a lot of fighting and a lot of fleeing, right? A lot of polarization and a lot of the kind of more self-indulgent self-care that people feel will get them to that space. But by itself, it won't, right? It needs that sort of deeper, and it's just as simple as closing your eyes, focusing on your breathing, and just letting your thoughts go. It's really as simple as that.
Wonderful. Yes. And I'm sure you'll have much more to share with regard to that and other things in the course. Thank you so much, Jeff. Your course, Jain Teachings and Practices of Compassion, is going to be the first course released in our Compassion Studies initiative here at Arihanta Institute. We couldn't be more honored or pleased to have you as our launching course to offer this wisdom in all the rich detail you have here, and I'm sure you will in the course. So thank you so much for joining me on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, and we'll look forward to the release of that soon.
Oh, same here. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm really looking forward to delivering the course. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do it.
Jai Jinendra, Jeff.
Jai Jinendra.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.